Hey everyone, and welcome to the Backyard Invasives Identification and Management of Terrestrial Invasive Species webinar. Next slide, please. I am Sean Kittle, and there on the right, I'm the Communications Coordinator for the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, also known as APIP. And this is Becca Bernacki, APIP's Terrestrial Invasive Species Coordinator. Hi, Becca. All right, next slide, please. So this morning, we are going to talk all about terrestrial invasive species. We're going to start with a brief overview and introduction to invasive species. We're going to get into a little bit of what makes a species invasive. And then Becca's going to take it away and talk about some management options, some species identification and specific management practices. And then we're going to have time for a Q&A at the end. And I just want to mention for the Q&A that will be at the end. So if you could put your questions in the chat or jot them down and ask during the Q&A, that would be much appreciated. Some questions will come up while Becca's speaking that might be really pertinent to what she's saying, and we might get those in there, but a lot of the questions we'll handle at the end. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, and before we get into APIP and invasive species, I do want to mention that 1.5 New York State pesticide credits are available for taking this course. To get the credits, you must watch this entire webinar and successfully complete a 10-question evaluation within 2 business days. We will post a link to the evaluation in the chat at the end of the webinar, and we will follow up with an email afterwards, which will also have the link for you. And just so everyone knows, we are asking for your address in the evaluation because we will need to mail your certificate to you. Next slide. All right, next we're going to get into what APIP is. Next slide, please. So what is APIP? APIP is actually part of a larger network of 8 PRISMs across New York State. PRISM, P-R-I-S-M, stands for Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. Each PRISM covers a region in the state. APIP's service area is the Adirondack Park and north to the Canadian border. To our immediate west, we have SLELO, which is the St. Lawrence Eastern Lake, Ontario PRISM. And directly to our south, we have the Capital Region PRISM. If you're calling in from outside of the Adirondacks area, you can take a look at this map to see which PRISM you should contact with any assistance you might need. Besides the ones I already mentioned, there are PRISMs in the Finger Lakes, Catskills, Western New York, Lower Hudson Valley, and Long Island regions. So here's a little background on APIP. Our program is funded by the Environmental Protection Fund, which is administered by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, or DEC. We are housed in the Nature Conservancy's Keene Valley office, which is right here in the Adirondacks. When it comes to invasive species management, APIP is able to work on land, managing terrestrial invasive plants and animals, and we are able to work in aquatic spaces, managing aquatic invasive plants and animals. So APIP's goals are pretty straightforward. We work to prevent new introductions of invasive species through education and outreach. We work to detect and eradicate infestations of invasive species by partnering with organizations and individuals. And we try to manage priority infestations, particularly when they are small and feasible enough to manage with the least number of resources possible. Private landowners can really bolster our efforts by managing invasive species on their own properties. As I just mentioned, a lot of our work revolves around education and outreach, and a big part of that is empowering landowners to conduct their own management efforts by hosting trainings like this one we're doing right now. Next slide, please. So when we talk about managing existing priority infestations, we're really talking about mitigating the negative impacts of invasive species. We'll get into some examples of those negative impacts, but first, let's talk a little bit about what makes a species invasive. So an invasive species must hit these 2 bullets. 1, it is not native to the ecosystem under consideration, and 2, it must cause some kind of harm, which we define as economic, social, or ecological. To be clear, a species that isn't native to an ecosystem isn't considered invasive by default. The species must cause some kind of economic, social, or ecological harm. We're going to start with an example of an invasive species, just to give you all an example of what we're talking about, and then we'll break these concepts down a little further. So whether a particular species is invasive or not really depends on the context of where you live. In other words, something that is considered invasive in one area might not be considered invasive in another. So here we have a lake trout. Lake trout are native to Canada, Alaska, the Great Lakes, New England, and parts of Montana. In fact, lake trout are prized by people who fish Lake Champlain. However, they are not so revered in Yellowstone National Park. Lake trout were first documented in the Yellowstone Lake, which is in Yellowstone National Park, in 1994. The species is not native to Wyoming, where most of Yellowstone resides. So what is the problem? Next slide, please. Well, the introduction of lake trout was devastating to Yellowstone Lake's population of native cutthroat trout. As you can see in this image here, cutthroats are a fraction of the size of lake trout. Lake trout happen to be extremely effective predators, and it turns out that they love to eat cutthroats. A mature lake trout can eat over 40 cutthroat trout in 1 year. That was a huge problem because cutthroat trout are a keystone species in Yellowstone Lake, meaning many other species, including bald eagles, grizzly bears, ospreys, and otters, depend on them for survival. Those species generally don't eat lake trout for two reasons. One, lake trout live in deep water, making them difficult to get to. And two, they're too big for most predators to handle. So this creates a pretty ideal situation for lake trout. There's plenty to eat, and they are pretty much safe from natural predators. To further compound the issue, lake trout can live 30 to 40 years, so what you have is a lot of eating of native fish over a long period of time. The effort to manage the lake trout population in Yellowstone Lake is ongoing to this day, and significant progress has been made toward eradicating the species, but has cost millions of dollars and a huge amount of resources have been expended to get to that point. A lot has been written about this situation, and you can absolutely learn more by going online. But the takeaway for our purposes is it has been a long, difficult, and expensive process, and the battle is ongoing almost 30 years later. Next slide, please. Now we're going to get into some of the details on why certain non-native species are considered invasive. And for this, I'll use examples that are specific to the Adirondack region. For starters, invasives lack natural predators or parasites. We just mentioned that in the lake trout example. Which basically means there is very little, if anything, keeping their populations in check. So Japanese barberry, which you can see in the lower right-hand corner here, is a poor forage for animals in our area. As you can see in the photo, the plant has some really nasty thorns that keep animals at bay. Another trait of invasive species is they can produce many offspring and or seeds. So for example, our purple loosestrife plant, one single purple loosestrife plant can produce millions of seeds. You can see some of them on the paper there. Invasives can also often reproduce in multiple ways. Yellow iris can reproduce by producing seeds or through incredibly fast growing rhizomes. So it has a couple of ways to get itself out there. Invasives also tend to be generalists, meaning they can handle a wide range of light, soil, moisture, and temperature conditions. So for example, the tree of heaven, lower left, is an amazing generalist, and to boot, it's also a host species of spotted lanternfly, which is an invasive insect. Invasive species can also monopolize available resources. So common reed grass, which is not pictured here, it's also known as Phragmites, is a good example of this. It can tolerate a wide range of growing conditions and overtake hundreds of acres, displacing important native wetland species. So if you can imagine, a species that checks off a few of the boxes above can pose a significant threat to an ecosystem. Something that is adept at rapidly reproducing, that can grow in a wide range of conditions and has no natural predators or parasites to keep its population in check, can quickly spread and outcompete native plants in a given area. The next slide, please. So lastly, I'm going to give, two photos didn't show up there. Lastly, I'm going to give a couple of the ecological, social, and economic impacts invasive species can have on a region before handing it over to Becca. And it looks like our last two photos showed up. They were in the waiting room, so they're with us now. So we're going to start with some ecological impacts. As with the purple loosestrife example that I just mentioned a minute ago, prolific seed producers can form a monoculture, which results in a loss of native biodiversity. You can sort of see that happening there in the upper left corner there. That's also garlic mustard, which has chemicals that prevent other plants from growing around it. Those chemicals also kill soil fungi that trees need. Swallowworts are part of the milkweed family, and monarch butterflies don't know the difference. Monarchs will actually lay eggs on swallowwort thinking it's milkweed, and the caterpillars that emerge will eat the plant as if it's milkweed. The problem with that is swallowworts contain a chemical that is toxic to the monarch caterpillars. So next, I'm going to get into a couple social impacts. Emerald ash borer, top right there, is an invasive insect that kills ash trees, including black ash, which are vital for traditional basket weaving practices of native Northeastern people. Social impacts can also include human health. One example of that is the sap from wild parsnip and giant hogweed produces some really nasty chemical burns when exposed to sunlight, and you can see that in the lower left there. It's bad. And lastly, let's cover a couple economic impacts of invasive species. Some invasive plants, like Japanese knotweed, can grow really tall and block guardrails and signs, so the Department of Transportation has to spend money managing them. Japanese knotweed roots can also grow through cracks in foundations, causing significant and costly damage to buildings. And there's always a potential loss of recreational value. For example, someone who visits the region to fish might find that they can't get to the river because the riverbank has been overtaken by a dense stand of Japanese knotweed. And again, that lower right-hand photo there shows Japanese knotweed, and you imagine that on a riverbank, it's pretty hard to get through that stuff. So that's just a brief overview of invasive species in general. Thanks you all for your time and your attention today. We really appreciate it. I'm going to hand things over to Becca now. She's our Terrestrial Invasive Species Coordinator. Thanks, Becca.
Thanks so much, Sean. Big round of applause for Sean, folks, on Zoom. That was his first presentation for us, and I think he rocked it.
Thank you.
So we're going to get into some management options now. Sean really laid out our trail map for today really well, and we're first going to talk about some management options. So that after that, when we get into the species specifics and talk about how to identify the species, when we talk about management options, we're all on the same page. First thing I'm going to talk about today is integrated pest management. Integrated pest management, or IPM, should be the cornerstone of any management plan. It's an approach that relies on the best approach or combinations of approaches to arrive at the desired management goal. The goal of an IPM approach is not always a total eradication, and we'll talk about what some other options are in a minute. But in some instances, reduction below a certain threshold may be sufficient to meet our goals. There are many steps to the IPM strategy, and we always think of this as a cycle that's constantly repeating. Invasive species management is rarely a one and done approach. We usually have to perform follow-up treatments and monitor the area as seeds emerge from the seed bank. So the first step in invasive integrated pest management, or IPM, is scouting. So we're going to pick an area where we want to scout to detect the presence of an invasive species. This may be our backyard, our favorite trail, or a woodlot. Once we scout the area, we want to be sure that we're correctly identifying the invasive plant. So you guys are making a great first step today. We're going to talk about 5 or 6 species later on this morning, and you'll learn how to identify them as well as their lookalikes. It's also really important to learn the biology of the species, because oftentimes we time our management based on the biology of the species. We're going to talk about a little bit of that later as well. Once we've determined what species is present that we want to manage, we're going to perform an assessment and determine what all of our management options are for our target species. Then we'll decide on our best management approach and go ahead and implement it. We want to apply the best management option at the optimal time of year under the appropriate conditions. So what that really means is often species are most vulnerable when they're in flower right before they go to seed, and we want to manage them at that time. For using a chemical treatment, we don't want to do that on a really windy or rainy day. Those are things that we want to avoid when applying herbicides. Finally, a few months or a few weeks later, we want to go back and evaluate whether our strategy works. And then we're going to address our management strategy for the upcoming year. Maybe we tried to manage something mechanically and it came back a little bit more than we'd like, and next year we need to try using a chemical treatment. Or maybe the alternative happened. Maybe we used a chemical treatment and had really good control, and now we only have a few saplings emerging in the following year, and we can mechanically manage those. As I mentioned on the previous slide, our goal may not always be total eradication or the elimination of all invasive plants and their seeds from an area. On the opposite side of the spectrum, we can choose to do nothing. Maybe we're just going to accept that that invasive species is in an area and choose to do nothing to management. In between those, we have containment, which is the next highest level of control under eradication. And that's where we try to contain the invasive species where it is and try to prevent it from spreading into the uninfected areas. Below that, we have suppression, where we want to suppress the invasive species just to protect a certain area. So maybe we have a flower garden that we don't want the invasive species to spread into, or we have some bush honeysuckle on the edge of our property that we're okay with being there, and it can spread in some directions, but we don't want it spreading into, our mowed lawn. Once we determine what our goal is, we need to come up with a site management plan. And as a reminder, a strong invasive species management plan is based on realistic goals as well as well-defined objectives. So to plan a site management plan, we want to ask ourselves 4 questions. The first is who. So what species are we going to target for management? The next question we'll ask is what? What management tools will we use? Will we use mechanical, chemical, or biological control? I'm going to talk about those in a few minutes. A lot of people find an invasive species on their property and they want to control it as soon as possible. And that's not always the best idea. We want to find out when that target species is the most vulnerable so our management has the biggest impact. And a lot of times that means figuring out when it sets seed so that we can manage it before it sets seed. And finally, where? Where will the management take place and at what scale? And to help us visualize that a bit more, I have a slide here. So imagine that big dark orange circle represents your 50-acre woodlot you're working on. This is green blob invasive species. And we have about a 5-acre area in that yellow circle that's completely invaded by the green blob invasive species. We're a landowner, we have this 50-acre property and we probably don't have the resources to jump right into managing that core infestation. Our highest priority is going to be to manage kind of those little outlier green blob invasive species. So maybe in our first year, we kind of target these few that are furthest away. We pick our management technique and we implement it, and we come back the next year and it's worked really well. Maybe the next year we work a little bit further in. So our goal is going to change and evolve as we work through this. And we're going to start by targeting the invasive species that are furthest from that core population. So now that we know a little bit about planning for our invasive species management, what tools do we have in our toolbox? The first and the greatest tool that we have is prevention. We can also implement mechanical controls. You can see someone there in the top right using a weed wrench to mechanically control a woody species. And we also have chemical control options. So today we're going to talk about cut stump treatments, foliar spray treatments, as well as stem injections. Those are not our only chemical control options, but those are the 3 we're going to highlight today. We also may have biological control options. Purple loosestrife is a great example of this. Beetles were released over 20 years ago to control purple loosestrifes, and we find them out and about helping us manage that species today. We also have cultural controls, which we're not going to talk about today, but those can include selective burning or grazing. What's really important to remember is that all methods will require multiple years of treatment. As I mentioned, prevention is our best strategy. It's the most cost-effective method. So if we can prevent a species from getting there in the first place, we don't have to spend time and resources managing it. A few things that we can do that aid in prevention is to learn to identify invasive species. A great example of prevention here is maybe you're at a trailhead in the Adirondacks. And as you know, a lot of our trailheads have you park on the roadside. You get out of your car and you walk into that roadside ditch and you see some purple loosestrife. It's a good signal to you that you should probably clean your boots off before you head further down the trail and after you get home at the end of the day so you don't spread the seeds around. We also tell folks not to purchase invasive plants. Most invasive plants are prohibited for sale in New York, but they do sometimes get on our shelves accidentally. I actually had a case of a landowner a few years ago who emailed me a picture of a plant that she had bought. And on the picture, on that little tag on the plant, it actually had a picture of the invasive. That landowner kept that species in the plot and monitored it for a year until we could decide if it was the native or the invasive. Thankfully, it was the native for sale. They had just chosen a bad picture for that ID card. We also always want to clean our tools and equipment after working in infested areas. So if we're out managing an invasive species with our shovels in one area of our yard, we want to clean that shovel off so that we're not spreading those seeds when we go work in our garden later on. Wherever possible, we want to use clean fill for construction and maintenance process. And finally, a lot of invasive species started out by being used in the ornamental trade. So it's entirely possible that there are invasive plants in your garden. We encourage folks to replace those invasive plants in their gardens with native alternatives. So getting into manual controls, first type of manual control we have is digging or pulling. When we dig or pull an invasive plant, the entire root system is removed. And we can use a digging tool. You can see Zach using a shovel there on the right, or a leverage tool. You can see Julie using a weed wrench there in the middle. Weed wrenches really work by giving you a mechanical advantage to kind of clamp onto the stem of the tree, and you can use that leverage to pull it down. After we remove the plant and the entire root system, we'll want to be sure to tamp down the soil. We like to say that disturbance opens the window for invasion. So by tamping down that soil, we're kind of limiting the amount of disturbance to the area. We often want to perform mechanical management during flower but before seed set. That's when the plant's most vulnerable. And if we manage things during seed set, we risk spreading those seeds around. So we always want to time our management to before seed set. Debris from your mechanical management can be chipped or mulched or burned on site if allowed under local ordinances. And it can also be left in brush piles with the roots above the ground. Those really apply to more of our woody species. If you're going to dig or pull smaller, more herbaceous species, we want to place those in a black contractor bag for 2 or 3 weeks in the sun until they're completely solarized. And when they become really brittle or a little bit mushy, they're and partially decomposed, they're no longer viable and can be disposed of in your native trash stream. Another form of manual control is cutting or mowing. This involves cutting plants at ground level, either manually or motorized equipment. So you can see in the picture here, there's volunteers using a pair of loppers. You know, we can also hop on our lawnmower or use a weed whacker to manage those species. Again, we always want to manage before seed set, especially when cutting or mowing. If you think about how your lawnmower flails around all the grass you cut, imagine mowing through an invasive species with seeds on it, especially like something like purple loosestrife, which can have up to 2.7 million plants per seed. You're really risking spreading those seeds around if you wait and manage during seed set. Again, the debris can be chipped or mulched or burned on site if allowed under local ordinances. It can be left in brush piles, and it can be put in contractor bags to solarize. What's really important to note here is that some species respond really vigorously to cutting or mowing via root suckers. So that's something you want to research when you're looking into the biology of the species that you're managing. We can also implement chemical controls. So the 3 we're going to talk about today are foliar spray, cut stump, and stem injection. The foliar spray is where we use a diluted solution of herbicide to the foliage of the plants. A cut stump is where we cut an invasive species off at the stump, and we apply a small amount of concentrated herbicide directly to that cut stump. And finally, a stem injection is where we use a small amount of concentrated herbicide and inject it into the hollow stem of a plant. Other potential methods include basal bark application and hack and squirt applications, and those will not be discussed today, but they are tools in your toolbox. A few notes on the use of herbicides. Some folks are resistant to the use of herbicides, and that's completely understandable. However, sometimes herbicides are our best option. This is especially true with species that spread via fragmentation, such as knotweed or Phragmites. Mechanical control risks spreading those species, so herbicides are our best option. We only want to use herbicides only when and where they will enhance the natural integrity of systems in which they are applied. And this is a Nature Conservancy policy. So what we mean by this is, if we think about a site that's invaded by invasive species, it's completely formed a monoculture and nothing else is growing there. If we remove that invasive species, we're going to allow the native species to recolonize and enhance the natural integrity and the biological function of that site. As always, we want to apply all herbicides in the most targeted and by the most targeted and selective means possible. We want to use the least toxic and lowest amount of product allowed by the label. I'm going to grab a sip of water here. So when using chemicals, we want to follow certain best management practices. And the first is to know your limits. I know we have a lot of pesticide applicators and technicians on here today, and we also have a lot of landowners. And what's really important to know is that non-certified applicators or technicians can only apply herbicide on their own property. So if you're a landowner and maybe you're managing some knotweed on the property line and your neighbor Bill comes over and says, hey, it's all right if you come over and spray this on my side too, I'd like that taken care of. That's not allowed by New York State law. We can only apply on property we own. Bill would either need to hire a certified applicator technician to do that work or treat it himself. We always want to wear appropriate PPE. Appropriate PPE is going to be listed on the product label. And the label is the law in New York State. So we always want to follow that law and protect ourselves. We want to be mindful of environmental conditions. Things we want to take into consideration are rain, dew, wind. If the plants are dewy, then herbicide may not attach as well to the leaves and may not work as well. If rain's imminent, we risk washing that herbicide off the plant. And wind is really important because we want to control our drift or the overspray of our foliar spray. We won't only want to apply that product to our target plant. We also want to be really cautious when applying near water. Most products in New York State that are available to landowners are not labeled for aquatic use. So in those cases, if you're 100 feet from wetlands or water bodies, we do encourage you to hire a certified applicator. We always want to choose an appropriate product and application method for our target species and setting. We can always check the label to see if that species is listed. As I've mentioned, and I'll still sound like a broken record today, the label is the law. Many species can be effectively controlled using glyphosate, triclopyr, and mazapyr-based herbicides. When we decide that that product is appropriate for that species, we want to check the label for the recommended dilution rate. And finally, be patient. A lot of the products that we're going to talk about today are systemic herbicides, meaning that they do not just kill the plant where they contact it. The herbicide is going to be taken up by the plant and translocated throughout it. And in many cases, it can take over 2 weeks for us to see visual signs of decline. So if we don't see decline right away, we don't want to go right out and respray. We want to give that herbicide time to work, and we recommend folks giving it about 2 to 3 weeks.
Hey, Becca, we have a quick question here. Will you be covering insects, fungi, or diseases affecting trees, especially pine trees?
We will not be covering anything affecting pine trees. But Andrew, if you send me an email, my email address, Sean can probably put that in the chat for us. Yes. I actually have a great fact sheet about some things influencing pine trees, and I'd be happy to share that with you. Getting back into our chat, so herbicides can be purchased both online and at local retailers such as Tractor Supply or local Lowe's or hardware store. This is just a list of some potential products we can use to give folks an idea. Don't worry about writing all this down. These slides are going to be shared on Friday with everyone. So getting into a little bit more of a how-to. So to perform a foliar spray, we're going to mix the herbicide following the manufacturer's label recommendations. And then using a backpack sprayer or a handheld sprayer, we're going to carefully apply the herbicide to the leaf surface of the plant. What's really important is we want to spray the plant leaves until they're wet, but not until the point of runoff. So you can see in this bottom picture right here, these plants are nice and glossy. They're covered in that herbicide, but the herbicide's not rolling off of them. As I said, we're going to mix according to the product label. So we want to read the label. When we're mixing, we also want to have a spill kit or an absorbent available. Most spills happen during mixing. We always want to be sure to also always be wearing our appropriate PPE, not just when we're applying the product, but also while we're mixing it. It's really important as we want to determine how much pesticide solution is needed. We don't want to mix excess pesticides. So, as an example, this is a 4-gallon backpack sprayer, but maybe I'm only spraying a small patch in my backyard. I don't need to mix this whole pack. I can mix a gallon. And when you're mixing, you always want to distance yourself from sensitive resources. So you can try to mix, I try to mix, on a hard packed gravel surface, can I pack on the road shoulder or in my driveway, that sort of thing. So that if I do have any spills, I'm not inadvertently killing any plants. So to mix 1 gallon of solution, we want to make a pesticide sandwich. So first we're going to add about 1/2 gallon of water. Then we'll add our herbicide, any surfactants or other adjectives. And then we'll add the remaining water up to the 1 gallon mark. Some helpful tips for when we're performing foliar sprays. As I mentioned, we want to avoid mixing surplus herbicide solution. So only mix the amount of product that you intend to use. It's better to have to go mix a second pack with a small amount than to have a few gallons sitting around in that backpack sprayer. We also want to adjust our spray nozzle to achieve an appropriate droplet size. So this is where wind comes into consideration. We might want a larger droplet if it's really windy, or a small droplet if it's a pretty calm day. We also want to be really careful to work from the inside of an infestation out, and this will help us avoid walking through treated areas. To help with that as well, we can also purchase an indicator dye to add to our herbicide mix to track our progress and ensure that we're not walking through those areas. In general, optimum treatment time is during peak flower. Getting into the next chemical control method we're going to talk about is the cut stump method. So steps 1 and 2 can kind of be mix and matched, but the first thing we want to do is cut the plants as close as possible to the ground level. And then we're going to mix our herbicide following the manufacturer's label. And then we can use a commercial grade spray bottle with an adjustable nozzle or a paintbrush to take that mixture and cover the cut stump with herbicides as soon as possible after cutting. When we mix these products, again, we want to read the label and mix according to the label. We want to have a spill kit or absorbent available and wear the proper PPE. So you can see the gentleman in this picture, he has his eye protection on, long sleeves, long pants. He has gloves and boots on. We're going to determine how much pesticide solution we're needed. Again, we don't want to mix extra, and we want to distance ourselves from sensitive resources. So as you can see in this picture, he's actually mixing over a concrete mixing bin so that if he has any spills, it's contained and easy to clean up. Again, to mix our pesticide solution, we're going to make a pesticide sandwich. So we're going to add our 1/2 amount of water, add our herbicide, any surfactants or dyes that are recommended, and then add the remaining amount of water. Some helpful hints for cut stump treatments. As always, we want to avoid surplus treatment or mixing surplus solution. We can use an indicator dye to track our progress. Something that's also helpful with these cut stump treatments is sometimes to use pin flags. So after you cut a plant, you can place a pin flag next to it, and then once you treat it, you can remove that pin flag. As always, we want to work from the inside of an infestation out to avoid walking through treated areas. We want to treat the stems as soon as possible after cutting. And these treatments tend to be most effective in the spring and the fall. The last chemical treatment method that we're going to discuss today is stem injection. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to calibrate our injector to the optimal dose. Then we'll fill the reservoir with the proper pesticide, and we'll consult the pesticide label to determine if dilution is warranted. Following kind of that same pesticide sandwich mixing scheme if dilution is warranted. Then what we'll do is we'll align the needle with the plant, insert the needle slowly into the plant, and then slowly and really importantly, fully squeeze the plunger 1 time because you've already calibrated it to apply the appropriate amount. You may need to support the stem above your site of injection so you don't push the plant over. Finally, you're going to mark the treated plant with a marker above the treatment site, and we do that above in case a little bit of that herbicide dribbles out. We don't want it to obscure the fact that we are marking indicating that we treated that plant. Getting into some helpful hints. Again, we don't want to fill that reservoir with excess chemical solution. Oftentimes we want to fill our reservoir over a catch basin, as you can see being done in the picture here, or an impermeable surface. As I mentioned, we want to treat mark our treated plants so we can keep track of which plants we've treated. We're going to work from the inside of an infestation to the out. And as always, our optimum treatment time is usually during peak flower. For all these chemical control methods, we want to be sure we're properly cleaning things up when we're done at the end of the day. So we want to try to use all our herbicide solution that we've mixed. While it's okay to keep that jug of concentrated herbicide around, we don't want to keep mixed pesticides in their containers. Once we've used up the herbicide in our backpack sprayer or our reservoir, we're going to fill the sprayer container about half full with water, agitate it, and pour out the rinsed water on an impervious surface. So that'll be a surface that's level and not near water surfaces where it can evaporate and not interfere with other plants. And we're going to repeat that process 2 or 3 times. So the next thing we're going to get into is species identification and specific management. And if you guys will allow me, I'm going to just look through the questions and comments real quick and just see if there's anything we need to address before we move on. So Ryan asks, have you found if a species is managed when there's an immature fruit on the seeds? Can it ripen in a brush pile? And that's a really great point, Ryan. If we are seeing those immature fruits, it's a good sign that, especially with those woody species, there's a chance that that's going to ripen on the plant. If we are going to brush pile that, I would maybe recommend laying down a tarp and brush piling that on the tarp so that anything that falls isn't on the soil where it can germinate. Thanks, Ryan, for pointing out that species that aren't listed on a pesticide label may have a 2EE pesticide label addendum, and for pointing folks in that right direction. And also thanks to Sane, who pointed out that we shouldn't spray at a time of day when pollinators are present. So pollinators tend to be present during the mid part of the day. We can kind of eliminate the threat to them by spraying at times when they are not on those plants. So we're going to get into the next part here. We're going to talk about some species identification and specific management to those species. The first species we're going to talk about is the knotweed suite. So the knotweed species are 3 closely related knotweed species. These are all very fast growing herbaceous perennial shrubs. In the Adirondacks, we have Japanese knotweed, giant knotweed, and Bohemian knotweed, which is a hybrid of the 2. These plants can grow up to 14 feet tall. Leaves vary in size between each species, with giant hogweed having leaves that can reach up to 12 inches in length, and Japanese knotweed having leaves that generally top out about 6 inches in length. They're going to be alternate on the stems, so they're not directly across from each other. The leaves are going to be really leathery in texture, and they're going to either be broadly ovate or heart-shaped, depending on the species. The stems are really the key identifier here for our knotweeds. The stems are very bamboo-like. A lot of times when folks reach out to me, they'll say, I have this bamboo on my property. What is it? How do I take care of it? The plants are going to have these bamboo-like stems, as I mentioned, that are jointed and hollow. They're going to be light green in color with purple spotches, and they're going to arise from spreading rhizomes, which we'll see in just a minute. The stem fragments can aid in plant dispersal, and a piece of a knotweed stem as small as a centimeter that has a joint present can form a new plant. The stems will die back in the winter, and those reddish-brown canes will remain visible throughout the winter. The flowers of Japanese knotweed are this really pretty cascade of flowers, white flowers, that bloom in late August. Beekeepers actually really love knotweed because it is one of the last species to go to flower in our region, along with the goldenrods. As I mentioned, the species spreads via its roots and rhizomes. So the roots are going to be a brown color with an orange interior. We can kind of see this orange. I don't know if you folks can see my pointer, but in this little broken stem here. And I kind of like to give the iceberg analogy. When we see a knotweed infestation above the surface, we need to keep in mind that these rhizomes may account for up to 2/3 of the plant biomass. So a lot of the biomass of this plant is actually below the surface and we can't see it. And these roots and rhizomes can actually extend up to 40 feet from the stems that we see above the ground. Looking at this, you'll see that a lot of these roots are really thick. They're like the diameter of my finger, and there's not a lot of really fine roots present. That'll become really important in a few minutes when we talk about the impacts of this plant. As I mentioned, the species spreads by the expansion of its underground root system and also by fragmentation. Segments as small as 1 centimeter with those nodes present can form new infestations. So for that reason, the species does not respond really well to mechanical treatment. If you tried to mow through this, you'd just make a whole bunch of little pieces that you can spread and make the infestation bigger. So this plant does emerge pretty early, which gives it an edge over native species. Nothing does tend to grow below those canes, and it really decreases the diversity. So if you think about nothing growing underneath that, we really have bare soil. And then we have those soil, and then we have those large roots that lack those fine root hairs. And this can lead to erosion, especially when a flood event comes through. So if we look at this picture here, we have knotweed growing on both of the stream banks. You can imagine if a large flood were to come through there, there's not those fine root hairs holding the soil together, and that stream could easily wash out, and that knotweed could spread downstream as a result. Getting into some knotweed lookalikes, bindweed is a non-native kind of agricultural weed. It differs from knotweed in that it is a vine and not a shrub. But especially early in the season, the leaves are easily confused. The leaves, however, on bindweed are going to be more deeply heart-shaped. So where the leaf attaches to the stem, it's going to have a much deeper V than we would see in knotweed. The leaves also aren't as leathery, in my opinion. Another early season lookalike are our native rough horsetails. This is especially true, like I said, really early in the growing season. If you look at these horsetails popping up in early spring, they do look pretty bamboo-like, but you will note that they have a spore-bearing body on the top that we can kind of see here in the foreground of the picture. So what are our management options? We can dig or pull very small infestations. So if we only have a few plants, we can dig them out, making sure to remove their entire root system. We can then place that plant material in a contractor bag, leave it in the sun for 2 to 3 weeks until it solarizes. So once it becomes partially decomposed, those plants are now non-viable, and we can dispose of that in our normal trash stream. If we have access to equipment to excavate, we can also go excavate that infestation. We want to be sure to excavate below the depth of the roots, so at least 4 feet deep, and in a 5-foot buffer around where we're finding those rhizomes. And that contaminated soil and plant material should be buried at least 5 feet deep to prevent reemergence. However, as with any management plan, we want to monitor the area for regrowth. On a lot of these slides, I'm going to have herbicides listed as well as concentrations. These are just the concentrations for the products that we at APIP use according to the label. You're always going to want to check the label of the product that you're using to ensure that you're using the proper dilution rate. So knotweed can be treated with a foliar spray of a glyphosate-based herbicide at a 3% concentration, with or without a 0.5% concentration of imazapyr. We can also use a glyphosate-based herbicide in a stem injection, where we're injecting 2 to 5 milliliters per stem at 100% concentration. As I mentioned, the species does spread via fragmentation, so we want to avoid using mowing as a management strategy for this species. The next species we're going to talk about today is purple loosestrife. Purple loosestrife is an erect herbaceous perennial. It grows about 3 to 7 feet tall, and it grows in a variety of wet habitats, wet meadows, marshes, riverbanks, edges of ponds and reservoirs, and everyone's favorite roadside ditches. The leaves of purple loosestrife occur either oppositely or in these three-leafed whorls, as we can see on the picture here. You can kind of see 3 leaves directly across from each other. The leaves are going to be lance-shaped with an untoothed or smooth margin or edge. The leaves may clasp the stem, and what's important here is that the leaf veins are not going to touch the edge of the leaf. My favorite diagnostic feature for purple loosestrife, though, is the stem. The stem is going to be angular or square-shaped. So if we take that stem and roll it in our fingers, it's not going to roll like a pencil. It's kind of going to chunk along like a small square. Small stems may shoot out above the main stem with mature leaves. And if we look at the picture on the right here, the previous year's stems do persist into winter and into the fall and growing season. And you can kind of get a sense of how many seeds are produced just by looking at how many seeds are remaining on that plant in this picture here. The flowers of purple loosestrife are a showy magenta, and they're easily identifiable from about July to September. So we're in prime purple loosestrife season now. The flowers are going to have 5 to 7 petals, which is going to be really important to remember when we talk about a native lookalike in a minute. And they grow in these flower spikes. The species really spreads via seeds. A single purple loosestrife plant can produce up to 2.7 million seeds per plant. The seeds are really tiny and can remain dormant in the soil for several years. So this gets kind of back to our prevention. You know, if you walk through a ditch that has some purple loosestrife in it and you get a seed on your foot, you know, in the treads of your shoe, and you spread it into that backcountry, that one plant can become millions in just a matter of years. So what's the impact of this species? Its fast growth allows it to outcompete native species, lowering our native biodiversity. And it can also alter the hydrology and nutrient cycling of the sites in which it is found. So on this slide, we're going to talk about some purple loosestrife lookalikes, and we have purple loosestrife in the middle there just for some comparison. Most common purple loosestrife lookalike that we see is fireweed. The big difference here is fireweed is going to have 4 petals per flower, where purple loosestrife is going to have 5 to 7. It may also have lightly toothed leaves, and it tends to be found in drier areas where purple loosestrife is found in wetter areas. Another lookalike we sometimes see is blue vervain, which is another native species. The flowers on this are, however, going to be much smaller. They're really tiny, and they're going to be blue in color. The leaves are going to be toothed, but it does grow in the same kind of wet habitats. I do not believe that fireweed has a square stem. I am fairly confident that fireweed has a round stem, just referring to the question that popped up in chat. As far as purple loosestrife management goes, for small infestations, we can dig or pull up those plants, again, always being sure to remove the entire root system. We can then place those plants into a bag and solarize them until they become partially decomposed, and then dispose of them in a normal trash stream. We can also cut or mow the species. We want to cut it to ground level prior to flowering, and we always want to be sure to not mow when it's in seed. You know, as we just talked about, it produces lots and lots of seeds, and mowing would just spread those around. If at all possible, after we mow, we do want to rake up that plant material and bag it and solarize it. We can also use a foliar spray as a chemical treatment for the species. We can use a glyphosate-based product at 1.5% concentration or a triclopyr-based product at 2%. Again, these are just the concentrations based on some products that we at APIP are using. You always want to check the label for the proper dilution rate for the product that you have. Purple loosestrife is kind of cool, and as we mentioned earlier, there are biological controls out there and working for us. One of those biological controls are these Garurucella beetles that you can see in the picture here. They're present throughout the Adirondack region, and they work by feeding on the leaves. This feeding on the leaves causes this window painting or a shotgun splatter-like pattern on the leaves. And then the plant needs to expend its resources healing those leaves, and it tends to not go to flower. If it doesn't go to flower, it doesn't produce seeds. We want to be careful not to manage plants that have these beetles present because we want them to have that habitat. Once they kind of reduce the purple loosestrife in an area, they will spread each year. What's really cool about these beetles is when Sean talked about how invasive species become invasive because they lack their natural predators. Oftentimes these beetles won't completely remove purple loosestrife from a system, but what they do is they introduce a pressure that reduces the purple loosestrife so that native species can grow around it. So that purple leaf strap is no longer causing a problem in that system because it's not limiting the biodiversity anymore. The next species we're going to talk about is wild parsnip, and I know a lot of folks had a question for this. Just saw a question come in and chat real quick. If biocontrol incidents are present, should one still cut the flowering, cut off flowers before seed set? And that's a great point. If the plant does go to flower, it's a great idea to cut off the flower if you see those biocontrols present. When our crews are out and our seasonal stewards are out, if they see biocontrol and a flower, they always remove the flower head. Getting into wild parsnip is an herbaceous perennial that commonly grows about 4 to 6 feet tall. It tends to be found in disturbed areas, so open fields, lawns, and especially roadsides. If you drive the Northway right now, especially heading towards the Plattsburgh area, you're going to see lots of this growing along the Northway. Wild parsnip is a big human health concern. As Sean showed, it does contain a toxic sap that can cause serious burns when you get that sap on your skin, and that sap is subsequently exposed to sunlight. This is maybe my one, nope, I have a second food reference today. So our first food reference for the day is the leaves of wild parsnip look very celery-like. They're compound, meaning it's a leaf made up of multiple leaflets. The leaflets do have very sawtoothed edges. And like I mentioned, they really resemble large celery leaves when you're out there in the field looking at them, especially when they're early in the growing phase like this. The stem is going to be branched, as we can see towards the top of this picture. It is hollow, and that hollow stem does contain that phytotoxic sap, and the stem is also going to be slightly grooved. The flower of wild parsnip occurs in these umbels or flower clusters. An umbel has the same root as umbrella, so we can kind of think of these as upside down umbrella flower clusters. Each of these clusters are going to be 2 to 6 inches wide, and each flower on those umbels are going to have 5 yellow petals that are going to be in bloom from about June to late August. The seeds of wild parsnip are very small. I did see some plants starting actually to go to seeds already last week. The seeds are small, they are oval shaped, and they are slightly ribbed or grooved, as you can see on some of these seeds in the front of the picture. My apologies about drinking water. I'm not used to talking for an hour straight anymore. The impacts of wild parsnip are that they tend to invade disturbed areas such as the roads and roadsides, that they can be an agricultural nuisance and come into agricultural fields from those areas. Another large impact of wild parsnip is that toxic sap. So if you get that sap on you and you are subsequently exposed to sunlight, you can get these phytotoxic burns. I did see a question come in where someone asked if we have recommendations on washing clothes with sap after removing wild parsnip. I'm not sure if hot or cold water would be preferred. The sap is very, very water soluble. So I would recommend, putting that in the wash by itself if you got some sap on your clothes, and then adding that extra rinse cycle just to give yourself a little bit of extra assurance. If you do get the sap on yourself, you want to cover that area immediately, wash it off immediately, and try to stay out of sunlight for the next 24 to 48 hours just to reduce your chances of getting those burns. Talking through some wild parsnip lookalikes. Again, we have wild parsnip in the center here so that we can see the plant in comparison to some lookalikes. The first is Golden Alexander. The leaves are going to be compound, but not nearly as celery-like. They're much more dissected, and they're going to bloom a lot sooner. So wild Alexander tends to bloom in May. It's not something we're going to see out in bloom this time of year, but the flower head can look similar. Another lookalike we see a lot of times is cow parsnip. Cow parsnip is a native plant. It tends to grow in the very similar areas, and it does still have that toxic sap. The flowers are white, however, as opposed to the wild parsnip flowers that are yellow. But that doesn't help us out when we're not in flower time. If we look at the leaves are going to be a little bit more palmate or wide at the bottom. Then the wild parsnip leaves are going to be a bit more oblong in shape. Getting into some wild parsnip management. Whenever we're managing wild parsnip, we want to be really careful to, of course, wear proper PPE if we're doing chemical treatment, but also wearing proper PPE if we are doing mechanical treatment. We want to make sure our skin is not covered and that we're wearing appropriate eye protection. So for small infestations, we can dig or pull them up. We just want to be sure to use a spade to cut that taproot, and any plant material that we remove, we want to place into a contractor bag and allow it to solarize until it's partially decomposed, and then we can just dispose of it in our normal trash stream. We can cut or mow the species prior to ground level, prior to flowering. Again, we don't want to mow when it's in seed, and we never want to weed whack this species. If you're up on your mower and you're mowing small plants, your risk of getting that sap on your skin is very, very small. However, if you're weed whacking, you're going to just kind of throw that sap around. If you want to see some pictures of some unfortunate gentlemen, you can Google wild parsnip burns weed whacker, and there are pictures out there of gentlemen who are out weed whacking the species without their shirts on and got it all over their chests. So we want to be really careful not to weed whack the species. We can also use chemical control for the species. Again, the dilution rates that I'm listing here are just based on the products we use. You always want to check your product label. We can use a foliar spray of a glyphosate-based product at 1 to 2% dilution, or a triclopyr-based product at 1 to 2% dilution. The next species we're going to talk about is another species that a lot of folks put in the chat that they were excited to learn about. And the species is Japanese stiltgrass. Japanese stiltgrass is an annual grass that sprawls along the ground as it grows. It's really well adapted to low light conditions, and due to that, it can thrive in a wide range of habitats, including woodlands, wetlands, fields, and roadsides. So this picture was actually taken at the first known infestation of Japanese stiltgrass within the Adirondack Prism. We found this last year due to a really diligent landowner who noticed the problem and reached out to us. What we suspect happened here is a contractor had placed a trailer here with some equipment and parked it kind of in this landing zone while they were working on construction of a new home. This is at the top of a hill, and we suspect that that contractor probably had some contaminated soil with some seeds in it on their tires. That mud that had the tires on it subsequently dried and fell off, and the seeds were allowed to germinate in this new area. Unfortunately, this is at the top of a hill and at the top of a drainage, and that species spread all the way down that drainage. And I highlight that example not to point fun at that contractor, but just to make it clear just how easy it is to spread these species. Seeds are very, very tiny, and they're very, very easy to spread. As I mentioned at the beginning, prevention is our best management tool, so we want to do what we can to prevent the spread of these invasive species. The leaves of Japanese stiltgrass are going to be the best way to identify the species. The leaves are going to be pale green and narrow and lance-shaped. So nothing super distinctive there. But what is really distinctive is that they're going to have this silvery off-center midrib that you can see highlighted in the picture. The leaf veins are going to be parallel. And if you take your fingers and rub it along the top and bottom of the leaf is going to be smooth in both directions as it lacks fine leaf hairs. This plant does produce flowers. Flowers from grasses don't look like our stereotypical flowers. The flowers are produced on slender stalks in late summer, and this species tends to go to seed in our area in late summer or early fall. I saw this species going to seed when we found it in very early September, so I think it was around September 8th or 9th when we were out there. Most of the plants had not gone to seed yet, but a few were just starting to, just to give you an idea of the phenology of the species. The impacts are really that this species forms extensive mats, as you can see in this picture, and that displaces our native species. There's really nothing else growing in the understory of this forest. The other scary impact here is that after senescence, so after those plants die off for the year, they are an annual grass, the thatch is very, very slow to decompose, and that can create a fire hazard, especially here in the Adirondacks. So what are some Japanese stiltgrass lookalikes? The most commonly encountered stiltgrass lookalike is whitegrass or cutgrass, and sometimes we refer to the species by scientific name Learsia because there are a lot of species that use those common names. It's going to be really similar in form to the Japanese stiltgrass. However, it is going to lack that silvery midrib. Japanese stiltgrass can also easily be confused with our native grasses. However, most of our native grasses, when you rub your fingers across the top and the bottom of the leaf, are going to be rough in one direction or the other. The Japanese stiltgrass lacks those keep saying root hairs, my apologies, those leaf hairs, and is going to be smooth in both directions. To manage Japanese stiltgrass for small infestations, if you have a few plants, you can dig or pull them. Again, you want to be sure to remove the entire root system. And then, as we've talked about for a lot of species today, we're going to place that in a contractor bag and allow it to solarize until it's partially decomposed. We can cut or mow this species. What's really important here is we want to cut or mow it as close to it going to seed as possible. If we cut it too early in the season, it can go to seed just on a smaller plant. Of course, we want to make sure that we're not mowing once it has gone to seed. Again, like the purple district, if possible, we want to rake up that plant material, bag it, and solarize it. Foliar sprays can also be used to treat the species. A lot of glyphosate-based herbicides can be used at a 1% concentration. Again, as always, you want to check the dilution rate of on the label of the product that you have. And we can also use a product such as a claim, and the rate is going to depend on the size of the plant when you're using it. Another species we're going to talk about is one that's really commonly encountered, but not one that we talk a whole lot at APEP, and that's multiflora rose. Multiflora rose is a thorny perennial shrub that grows up to 15 feet in height. It's frequently found in forest edges, canopy openings, riparian corridors, fields, and forested wetlands. The leaves are going to be alternate on the stem, and the leaf is going to be compound. So we're going to have 5 to 11 leaflets, 1-inch leaflets on a single leaf. The leaflets are going to have toothed edges. And what's really important is that they're going to have this green fringe that we can kind of see right here where the leaf attaches to the stem. That's going to be important when we talk about some lookalikes. The stem is going to be a long, flexible, green or reddish in color, and it's going to be covered in numerous recurved thorns. So if you look at the thorn kind of is going to curve back instead of being perpendicular to the plant. Finally, talking about the fruits and flowers of this plant. Flowers are going to be numerous clusters of showy white, usually white, but sometimes pink flowers that bloom in May or June. Flowers are going to be about 1 inch wide and have 5 petals. In summer, the flowers are going to develop into small hard red fruits that are about 1/4 inch in size, as we can see on the right here. This species is really spread by seeds as birds and mammals eat those seeds and spread them around. And its impact is that is a prolific seed producer, and birds and mammals really aid in the dispersal, especially the long-range dispersal of the species. Once in an area, they can quickly overtake it. As Sean mentioned, with the barberry, the species also does have thorns that make it unpalatable to animals. And if you're trying to walk through your woods, I'm sure we've all walked through multiflora rose before. I had a supervisor called it multi-painful rose. You know, it kind of can ruin our recreational value. We do have native rose species that grow in our region. However, the thorns on those species tend to be more perpendicular to the stem instead of the recurved thorns that we have on multiflora rose. They're also going to lack that fringe at the leaf attachment. So you can kind of see this green fleshy bit where the leaf attaches to the stem and it doesn't have those little fringes sticking out on it. Multiflora rose can also look like our native raspberries and berries. Again, it's going to lack that fringe at the leaf attachment. And if they are in fruit, our native berries are going to have a berry instead of that hard hip. Multiflora rows can be managed mechanically for small infestations. We can dig or pull it, always being sure to remove the entire root system, placing it into a contractor bag and solarizing it. We can also cut or mow it. We can cut it to ground level. It's going to take multiple cuts per year. We want to do that prior to flowering. As always, we don't want to mow it when it's in seed. We want to bag and solarize that plant material if possible. For chemical treatment, we can use either a foliar spray or a cut stump, depending on how big those plants are, of either a glyphosate or a triclopyr-based product. I think we've reached our final species that we're going to talk about today, and that's tree of heaven. Tree of heaven is a rapidly growing deciduous tree capable of reaching about 80 feet in height. It tends to grow on open, disturbed sites. So the leaves of tree of heaven are going to be alternate on the stems and not directly opposite from each other. It does have, those compound leaves with 10 to 41 leaflets per leaf. The leaves are going to have smooth edges with the exception of the base of the leaf. They're going to kind of have this glandular node or glandular teeth right at the base of the leaf. And when you crush up those leaves, they're going to have a rancid odor that some people smells like old peanut butter. I've also heard that some people describe that smell as cat urine-like. Our second food reference for today is going to come in the form of the tree of heaven bark. The bark's going to turn from a brownish green to a light gray brown as the tree matures. And the bark of these plants really does look like cantaloupe. So it's got a cantaloupe-like bark. The fruits and flowers. Flowers are going to be small, yellow, green in appearance. They're going to form these flower clusters in late spring and early summer. The flowers are going to mature into large clusters of single ring samaras in late summer. If you don't know what a samara is the seeds like we have on our maple trees. So you can kind of think of these as like those half helicopters. The seeds are going to hang out on the trees and persist throughout the winter and dry as the summer moves on. The species is really spread by seeds. A single tree of heaven can produce up to 300,000 seeds. And like our maple seeds, these are dispersed by the wind, so they can spread up to 300 feet from the parent tree. As Sean talked about, a lot of our invasive species have high reproductive potentials. So not only does this species produce a lot of seeds, it also produces those seeds at a very young age. Sprouts as young as 2 years old can produce seeds. The species can also reproduce. So Sean mentioned that a lot of invasive species have multiple forms of reproduction, can also reproduce via root suckers. And those root suckers can occur as far as 50 feet from the parent plant. So a few years ago, I was out at my father-in-law's house in Western New York, and he knows I like plants a lot. So he said, "Hey, Becca, what's this thing growing, near my fence? It was only a couple of feet tall a few weeks ago, and now it seems like it's almost as tall as my fence." So I walked over and I looked at the leaves, and I knew almost immediately that it was tree of heaven. And I knew it had to come from somewhere. So I kind of looked around, and sure enough, there was a big tree of heaven, almost as tall as the house across the street. I was curious, was this a seed that landed here, or was it a root sucker? So I dug down a little bit and I found the roots, and sure enough, a sucker had grown underneath the road and the tree had come up in my father-in-law's yard. So, kind of interesting how prolific these guys are. Tree of heaven is important not only because it's invasive species itself, but also it is the host species of another invasive species, spotted lanternfly. As I just mentioned, the primary tree that these spotted lanternflies feed on is tree of heaven. Spotted lanternfly is a huge threat to our commercial agricultural industries, such as fruits and grape production. It also targets at least 25 species of forest trees. Spotted lanternfly was first found in New York in 2020 in Staten Island and has been pretty quickly spreading throughout the state. There are a lot of resources available from our partners as well as on our website if you want to learn more about spotted lanternfly. Another reason I wanted to touch on spotted lanternfly very, very briefly in this presentation is because of their egg masses. So females will lay these grayish brown egg masses on any hard surface. You can kind of see this kind of caterpillar-like looking egg mass. And those females are then going to cover them with these creamy white substance that kind of looks a little bit like concrete. To me, it's going to turn a dark brown as it hardens. Females are going to lay these eggs from about September until the first hard killing freeze. But that's really important is that they're going to lay these on any hard surface. So right now, spotted lanternfly is going gangbusters in Pennsylvania. We are not that far from Pennsylvania. If you're bringing an RV or a boat trailer, or even your vehicle, if you're down in Pennsylvania and visiting, you want to be sure to check your vehicle for these egg masses before you come back up north, just so that we can prevent the long distance movement of these eggs. So coming back from our small spotted lanternfly sidebar and getting back to Tree of Heaven, the impacts of these species, the impacts of Tree of Heaven. This species does produce chemicals that inhibit the growth of other plants, allowing it to quickly outcompete native species. A, due to those chemicals, but B, also due to its rapid growth rate. Getting into some lookalikes, I'm just going to bring up a Tree of Heaven leaf here so that we can see it. Staghorn sumac is probably the most commonly encountered lookalike. It does have compound leaves that look very similar. However, the leaves of Staghorn sumac are going to have serrated or toothed edges, where Tree of Heaven has those smooth edges with the exception of that node at the bottom. Staghorn sumac is also going to have a red fuzzy fruit as opposed to those samaras that Tree of Heaven produces. And as we get into fall, Staghorn sumac leaves are going to turn red, where Tree of Heaven turns to turn yellow. Black walnut is another common lookalike. Again, the leaves of black walnut are going to have fine serrations on them, where Tree of Heaven has smooth leaf edges. And black walnut is also going to produce those green nuts that we're all pretty familiar with. To manage Tree of Heaven for small individuals that are less than 3 inches in diameter at breast height, so about 4 feet tall, less than 3 inches in their diameter at the height of about 4 feet, we can dig or pull them out. We always want to be sure to remove the entire root system. We can then take that plant material and chip it, or burn it if burning is allowed under local ordinances, or we can place it in a situation where the roots are up and not allowed to touch the ground. We can put it on tarp, we can hang it upside down in the tree. We can cut Tree of Heaven. However, it does produce a lot of root suckers in response to mechanical management. If you're going to do a cut treatment, it's highly recommended that you do a cut stump treatment in association with that. So there are a lot of chemical options here for Tree of Heaven. You can use a foliar spray on small individuals. Oftentimes, a glyphosate-based herbicide is going to call for a 5% dilution. Again, check your label. You can use a cut stump solution with a glyphosate-based herbicide at 50 to 100% solution. Or we can use a hack and squirt treatment, which we didn't talk a lot about today, but that's more targeted towards our pesticide applicators we have on our call today. And we can use a glyphosate-based product at 50 to 100% solution, making a 1 inch cut per diameter inch of those trees. So we're starting to wind things down here. And I only talked about a handful of species today, and there are a lot more invasive species out there. I highly encourage folks who are interested to visit our website at adkinvasives.com. You can click on the invasive species tab at the top of the page and our species profiles for some of the highest priority species in our region. We've also given a bunch of webinars over the last 2 years, and maybe one of the little bright sides of the pandemic is we've all become very familiar with Zoom. So we've had every webinar we've given in the last 2 years recorded and available on our website. There are lots of webinars that cover lots of different species, but if you enjoyed today's presentation, I highly encourage you to check out last year's Backyard Invasives, which we gave last fall. We talk about a lot of woody invasives, buckthorn, bush honeysuckles, barberries, that are really, once we get into fall, is a prime time to manage those. Talking about control methods, APIP does have an invasive species best management practices guide available on our website that walks you through what I talked about today in more detail and covers all the species on our website. There are also other resources available on our website, such as best management practices and advice for replacing your garden plants with native alternatives. And one thing that I did want to mention for the pesticide applicators on today's call is that if you report, if you report your management through IMAP Invasives. IMAP Invasives can help you generate your annual report at the end of each season. For those of you attending today's talk for pesticide credits, again, we are offering 1.5 New York State pesticide credits in categories 2, 3A, 6A, and 9. You do need to view the entire webinar, so we have about 10 minutes left here for a Q&A. And you will need to complete a 10-question evaluation within 2 business days. So that quiz will close at about noon on Friday. You do have unlimited attempts to pass that quiz, but a passing score of 70 is required. As a part of that quiz, you will be asked to provide your mailing address, and that is the address that we will mail your certificate to. So bear that in mind when you enter the address. You're also going to want to bring your applicator technician card so that you can enter your applicator technician number in the quiz. The quiz is going to take place in the form of an online form. So Sean, if you don't mind just placing that link in the chat in a few minutes here. Thank you, Sean. And Sean is also going to send you a follow-up email after we get off here today with that link as well. We always record these webinars and provide them to folks after the fact in the follow-up email. Typically that takes place the afternoon of. However, to ensure that folks watch this entire webinar and attended live throughout, we cannot send that information out until the quiz closes. So Friday afternoon or Monday morning, keep an eye out for an email from Sean that will include this recording as well as a link to that pest management practices guides. So without further ado, we're going to move into questions. Folks are encouraged to put questions in chat. I may ask Sean to read me a couple of questions that came in, and folks are encouraged to come off chat and ask their questions verbally as well.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. The link to the evaluation, I did put it in the chat a couple times. I can throw it in there again. We're getting a lot of compliments. Thank you all for that. Here's the link to the chat one more time, or the evaluation one more time. Becca, I have a few questions that came in that I don't believe you addressed during the presentation. We could start there if no one else has any pressing questions.
Yeah, I think that works for me.
Cool, okay. First one, are there plans to ban invasive plants from being sold in New York nursery and garden centers?
So right now we have the Part 575 list. I think at one point, Ryan, thanks for helping with chat as we've worked through this. For those that don't know, Ryan has my job in another one of the prisms and is attending today. So it's always great to have those folks on. So there's the Part 575 list, which is the prohibited list of plants in New York State that aren't for sale at nurseries. There are some species we're seeing become invasive that aren't on that list, and there's been talks about updating that list to include those species in the next couple of years.
All right, next one. Can landlords apply pesticides to owned properties at which they do not personally reside?
Ooh, that is a good one. Do not quote me on this. You're going to want to check the regulations. I do believe, and maybe someone with more pesticide experience than me can chime in here, I do believe you are allowed to apply those, but you must notify the tenants. Again, do not quote me on this one. Be sure to check New York State's regulations before doing so. Those sorts of questions are great questions to reach out to the folks at DEC and their pesticide bureau.
All right, we have a couple in the chat here. One from Chris. Can people freely destroy invasives in the Adirondack Park?
Yeah, so you can manage invasive species on your own property. If it's public property, you're going to want to get permission from the landowner. And you know, if you and your neighbor want to work together and mechanically remove invasive species on both your properties, that's totally doable. The big caveat there is that we can only chemically manage invasive species on property that we own. And of course, like I said, if we're managing on property that's not ours, we do need to check with the landowner to see if that's something that they're okay with.
All right, and can people email photos to us for plant identification?
Of course. So our email addresses are here. You can email me pictures of plants if you ever have a question. The caveat there is that my specialty is in invasive species. I know a lot of plants, but I don't know every plant. But if I don't know your plant, I'm going to try to get you in touch with folks who do have answers for you.
All right, and Ryan just put one in. What is your recommendation for pesticide rinsate collection and disposal?
So Ryan, I'm just making sure that I'm understanding your correct question correctly. So when our pro crews are out, when applicators are out, usually we're going to use that rinsate in our next mix tank, just to avoid dumping it. A lot of times, if you are a small landowner, you're only managing a few things, you're not going to be mixing another pack anytime soon. Maybe you're only going to mix one pack a year, or you're only mixing a small amount in a spray bottle. In those cases, that's where we really tell folks, try to find a really impervious surface and pour that rinsate on that impervious surface and allow it to evaporate. And Ryan, I apologize. Brendan makes a great point here that we can also purchase a spray tank neutralizer as well to use to neutralize those pesticides.
All right, and I have a few more that I made a note of here. This one says, Rebecca mentioned tamping down the soil to limit seed germination in disturbed soil. Is it ever recommended to treat soil with an herbicide to limit growback?
Yeah, so there are pre-emergent herbicides available on the market, and pre-emergent herbicides, really stop that germination from occurring. So, if you know that there's seeds in that area and you want to apply those pre-emergents, that's a great option as well.
And Chris made a point. I've found that leaving the pulled plants crumpled on top of the same spot can block resprouting by blocking light.
Yep, that's a great point. As long as, we're keeping those roots out of contact with the soil and, kind of preventing them from rerooting, that works as well.
Right, we had a question about wild parsnip. It says, step on shovel to cut taproot, will the plant die?
Yeah, so wild parsnip, if we cut that taproot, if we cut it low enough on that taproot, generally that root's not going to resprout in the year. And then we want to take that plant that we've cut, essentially by cutting the taproot, and place that plant material in a contractor bag and solarize it and follow that process.
Right, we have another wild parsnip question. For how many years will parsnip seeds persist in the soil and then sprout? And then there's a little follow-up. Is it better to bag the pulled parsnip rather than making a pile to avoid the flowers going to seed on the ground?
So I'm not sure exactly how long the seed bank is for wild parsnip. I believe it's 7 or 9 years. Maybe someone on the call has a better idea than I do. And as far as, I'm sorry, can you remind me of the second part of that question?
Sure, you may have already answered it. Is it better to bag the pulled parsnip rather than making a pile to avoid the flowers going to seed on the ground?
Yeah, so for all of our invasive species, it's always best to place it in a contractor bag and allow it to solarize and get rid of it, just so that we never risk reintroducing it. We never want to add invasive species to our compost piles. If we are, managing a large amount of something like a bush honeysuckle or something that's woody, we can put that on a brush pile, just being sure not to let the roots come in contact with the ground. Of course, we want to make sure we don't have any seeds. Even non-viable seeds can still ripen. We may want to put that brush pile on something like a tarp for a year or two.
All right, we have a new question in the chat here. Can you suggest a pre-emergent for Japanese stiltgrass?
I cannot off the top of our head. Unfortunately, we are just learning in our prison how to deal with Japanese stiltgrass. We had our first infestation last year. So we have not gotten to the phase of using pre-emergence to control for that species yet, and kind of treating the seed bank that way.
Right, and I have one last question that I made a note of, and it is, for how many years will garlic mustard seeds persist in the soil and then sprout?
Garlic mustard, I do know because I just looked it up the other day. Garlic mustard is, depending on the literature, most folks agree it's about 7 years.
And Ryan just added a comment in the chat. I just want to bring everyone's attention to it. He says, if you cannot remove via bagging, keep the plant material within the infestation area in as small of an area as possible. Make note of the location and monitor frequently for resprouts or seed germination. Okay, we have a question. Oh, go ahead, sorry. Back
yep, and I'll get to that question in a second. I just wanted to thank Ryan for helping answer some of these questions. It's really appreciated. I see someone's asking, how do we remove or control leafy spurge? Leafy spurge responds pretty well to pulling or digging. That's, we do manage it in one place on the Whiteface Highway where unfortunately DOT use some contaminated fill up there. We do pull it because there are a lot of rare and threatened endangered species up there. Bear in mind though that the milky sap that leafy spurge does have can cause a skin reaction in some folks. So you want to wear gloves and long sleeves and that sort of thing if you are managing that species. Then I see Chris is asking about knapweed. So knapweed is a common roadside invasive species. It's not one that we at APIP manage because it does tend to only grow in disturbed areas. We see it a lot on the roadsides. I know DOT does manage it. If you're interested, we give it an annual training to DOT folks. And the one that we gave in May is actually recorded and available on our website. And there is a little tutorial like we did with these species about knapweed as a part of that presentation.
We had one on how about a pre-emergent for Japanese honeysuckle?
I don't personally use pre-emergence in my job, not for any reason in particular, just we tend to use, glyphosate and triclopyr and imazapyr, imazapyr can be seen as a pre-emergent. But it's not something I'm super familiar with, so I'm going to have to defer to answering that one.
And I should say, if you left a question for Becca in the chat that we didn't get to, and I missed it, please put it back in the chat right now so we can get to it.
Well, I want to thank everyone for spending some time with us today. As Sean mentioned, education is really one of the big arms of what we do, and helping folks learn to identify these species and managing them on their own goes a long way. Of course, as always, feel free to reach out with any questions or comments that you may have, and we will probably end it there.
Yeah, and it looks like if you're in the lower Hudson region, Ryan did put his email in the chat there. So if you want to reach out to him, if you're in that region, there it is.
And I think, so